My wife Kim and I had planned our vacation for a year in advance, and we had previously hiked in 3 national park systems. This year we planned on spending a month exploring Zion and Bryce Canyons in Utah. We entered Utah at the Four Corners area and spent the night at a motel in Blanding. At dinner that evening, we met another couple who were also vacationing. They told us about the hike that they had just taken, and said the scenery defied description. We decided to deviate from our plans and explore in the area they mentioned. Early the next morning, we visited the local tourism building and told them we needed maps and directions to this place named Dark Canyon. So we purchased several maps of the general area. Our backpacks were already filled with the basic necessities, and we topped them off with enough food and water to last us a week if necessary, because we had learned the hard way to pack extra, just in case. After a pleasant drive and then stopping at a visitor area, we quickly read the large, colorful maps and postings that directed hikers to the main trails. We compared the maps we had so that we were oriented as to which direction to head out. We followed the directions we received to the trailhead at the end of Wooden Shoe Road. We shouldered our heavy backpacks and started out by following the well-worn trail for about 4 miles until we reached Cherry Canyon. At this point, we spotted another indistinct trail, and although it looked like it might be difficult, mainly only because it was curved to the left and it appeared to drop into the vast side of the canyon, at a steep slope too, we decided to venture off the beaten path and take this trail. The route wasn't well traveled, and the Park Service had obviously not spent time maintaining this trail, as we were constantly stepping over and around the rocks and debris that came from the canyon cliffs above. The trail seemed to discourage visitors, but made it more appealing as we liked discovering places not so heavily visited. As we made our way along the 2 to 3 foot wide trail, we were dropping at a rapid rate along a natural shelf that was almost like it had been formed by a volcanic flow of lava that oozed down a smooth path and left a perfect path for us to walk on. We did remark about the fact that our rapid progress would make it more difficult on the return trip, but we knew it would all average out in the end. The detailed map identified the rugged spires and monoliths that we had observed ahead of us as Badlands, which was to caution hikers to the fact that there were no maps of these side canyons and slot canyons that from a distance seemed impenetrable from where we were. Our goal was to reach the flat desert floor on this main route, and then to explore the many possibilities, hoping to find and photograph ancient petroglyphs that we anticipated would be there. We also hoped to find those unexplored areas that most hikers seem to pass through without observing much at all. Most visitors seem to be limited on time, so they want to see as much as possible as quickly as they can. Fortunately for us, we had all the time we wanted. It was getting late in the day, and as we were looking ahead for a good place to spend the night, a movement off to our left caught our attention. An animal of some sort was being attacked by a group of 4 large hawks. We figured it to be a young coyote as it appeared to scramble a ways, and then one of the hawks would swoop in, grab it, fly up a few feet, and then just drop it on the rocks. Then another would dive in on it with the same results. They seemed to be wearing it down by these series of attacks, and finally it must have had no strength left to continue fighting, and all 4 birds were devouring it. As we observed this scene play out, it showed us how tough life in these harsh lands must be. Then, as we watched, the afternoon sun illuminated an apparent path upward that we had not noticed before, as it was so obscure. Had we not been watching the coyote and secretly hoping it would get away, we never would have even spotted it. The path was more of a smooth floor between ridges, which obviously was used by a myriad of animals, but due to its beginning being dotted with some thorny bushes and a variety of cactus plants, humans would most assuredly pass it without even a second notice. We just had to take it. As we soon concluded, we were very likely to be one of the few people to have ever been here, as it appeared to be totally an animal trail with absolutely no sign of humans ever treading this ground. Since we came here for adventure, we tied a piece of red flagging material to some tall brush on the trail side to mark our return trail, and we began to slowly climb at a moderate angle. But We were in enough of a depression that we could no longer see the valley we had traveled through. We realized that the low ridge we were alongside must have kept this trail secret, hidden from exploration, as there wasn't a single boot print, cigarette butt, or piece of debris anywhere, as we almost always find in abundance in these areas. We continued to climb at a steady pace, and it was getting late. We began looking for a place to camp for the night. Our trail finally leveled off, and we were now curving further off to the right around a high cliff. And as we curved slowly around, there up the slope to our left, about 200 feet, was an apparent narrow slot canyon. So we climbed the slight incline until we reached the entrance. The canyon was narrow, almost like a large crack or slit in the 300-foot high cliffside. It was about 10 feet wide with a flat, smooth sand floor. The canyon went back in about 100 feet and ended in an almost flat wall. There was a large boulder that had fallen from above, effectively blocking the canyon about 20 feet from the end. The boulder was around 15 feet in diameter and quite round. We decided to spend the night just inside this slot canyon. Kim began rolling our bedrolls out, and I searched around for signs of any ancient inhabitants. As I was looking around at the smooth canyon walls beyond the huge boulder, a streak of sunlight from the constantly changing earth rotation happened to appear on the other side of the large boulder. It didn't make sense, as it seemed to be coming directly from the side beyond and to the right of this slot canyon. I ran back to the boulder while calling to Kim to bring flashlights, and while she was digging out our lights, I wedged my foot between the boulder and the wall and clawed my way atop this monster rock. There to my right, perfectly obscured and invisible from the front of this canyon, was a large cut that ran back at a 45-degree angle toward the front of the cliff. It was another opening. Helping Kim to join me on the other side of the rock, we entered this new canyon immediately. It was about 5 feet wide and opened straight above our heads to the sky above. No wonder it was not visible from the entrance. It only became noticeable because of that momentary turning of the earth that permitted the sunlight to give away its existence. We walked slowly ahead, our way lighted by the slowly retreating sun, when suddenly this passage ended in a large circular cavern which must have been 30 feet wide and almost the same in length. The ceiling was covered like it was a cave, except for a large opening above that allowed the sun to illuminate the entire room, and also offered a shelter along its sides from occasional rains, which were apparently channeled along the walls of this room. It looked as if there were trenches on both sides that almost seemed like they were man-made in order to channel the runoff toward an outside exit. We made our way to the far end of this cave, and I leaned through the side opening far enough to view the valley floor far below, to what appeared to be a separate canyon from the one we had just left. We immediately made the decision to spend the night in this cavern, as it was an adventure like no other we could imagine. I returned to the original entrance and climbed back over the large boulder and passed our backpacks and bedrolls over to Kim, and then joined her to return to our cave. Once we retrieved our flashlights, we began to explore our new hideout. This is when we discovered we were not alone. When we first entered the cave, I had left my canteen just inside the entrance, but upon returning, it was not there. As we began searching the areas of this cave, there was my canteen in the far corner of the cave. It looked as though it had just been tossed aside. It was also at an angle with the cap down against the wall, an angle I surely would never have left a canteen, especially not my own. We searched carefully with both lights, along with our fluorescent lantern, which we positioned in the center of the room so we would have sufficient light. In the far corner, which would have been almost even with the original slot's end, which would put it to be about 20 feet beyond the boulder, we spotted an almost undetectable and very narrow crack in the wall. I shone my light inside this passage that proved to be about 2 feet wide, and the crack reached upward where it was impossible for us to tell how high. This passage seemed to go on into the mountain so far that even my powerful flashlight couldn't illuminate it enough to see if it ended or just curved from sight. And now we were nervous, but our combined thoughts, did not put us in fear, as it could have just been a coyote, or maybe even a curious ground squirrel, or just another small animal that moved the canteen, even as heavy as it was. Being thoroughly exhausted by a very long and strenuous hike, we had a quick meal of trail mix, and we laid our sleeping bags in such a way that we could see the night sky, and both fell asleep extremely quickly. Sometime later, I awoke to Kim's scream, and I grabbed my light and my revolver at the same time. Kim was cringing in fear, shaking uncontrollably. I played my light around the room and caught just a glimpse of a shadow at the entrance of this cavern. I didn't dare fire a shot, as I didn't have a clear target, and also there was that unknown result of the damage that a gunshot would cause, like a cave-in. Kim was almost in a state of shock. She said someone had felt her face, and it felt like a hairy or furry hand, but she distinctly felt that it had long claws, and she had 4 red marks on her cheeks to show for it. My watch showed it to be about 2 a.m., so we decided to leave the fluorescent light on low and tried to take turns dozing off until daylight, figuring that whatever it was seemed just as afraid as my wife was. So I hoped they both preferred to have no more contact with one another. Kim had finally fallen asleep, and I was on my side facing her when I saw our mysterious visitor. It was slowly creeping toward us from the entrance, and I squinted my eyes, pretending to be asleep, while reaching very slowly until my hand found my gun. The creature was moving almost imperceptibly towards Kim, so slow you couldn't even see it, and as I grasped my fingers around the butt of my revolver, I slowly moved my arm until it was in ready position, while all the time squinting as though my eyes were closed. And just as the intruder began to reach a long claw towards Kim, I bolted up and pulled the trigger. I had considered whether I would dare to shoot if the animal had returned, and since it was only a .22 caliber gun, it really made more noise than anything. But in the confined cave, it was truly deafening. Kim screamed as the animal shrieked a horrible sound and the cave lit up. The explosion seemed huge, and the black hairy beast literally flew up and whirled out the entrance. The flash of the gun along with the lantern gave me a good look at it. It had long, black, very fine hair all over it that waved in the wind as it ran. Its long claws were very prominent, and it was quite thin. And its eyes, I'll never forget those eyes. They were yellow, and they almost seemed to be glowing like they had a light behind them. It was apparent before I even fired the shot that it gave off a glow of its own from behind those eyes. Being as how it had been stooped over, and when it ran, it seemed almost spider-like in its movements, I couldn't begin to estimate its size or weight, but my guess would be if it stood straight, it would have had to have been at least 6 or 7 feet tall. And as you can guess, that did it for us. With the fluorescent on high, we gathered our equipment, rolled up our sleeping gear, and prepared to leave. It was at that time that we noticed that this cavern did show signs of occupancy that we had clearly missed before. There were mounds of sand that we ended up allocating time to dig up. As curious as we were, and after being attacked by such a mysterious thing, we just had to know. In the digging, we revealed piles of bones and shards of what seemed to be pottery. Not sure whether we were wishing we could take it all back, or wishing we had time to explore this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, we were becoming more concerned with our safety. We climbed back over the boulder in the slot canyon, and we again made it to the outside. We both breathed a huge sigh of relief when suddenly our scary visitor dashed by us and ducked behind a rock beside the trail. The sky had lighted enough that we were both able to see it plainly, and it must have actually thought it was hidden because it grunted like it was afraid when it bolted. While Kim held the lantern, I followed it around the rock, revolver in one hand, flashlight in the other. I jumped quickly around the side of the rock and startled a large coyote. The coyote quickly scampered around the rock outcropping and disappeared. There was no sign of our big, scary creature. As I shined my light around, there on the sand beneath my feet were some wet spots, and under my light it appeared to be blood. Then on a white piece of granite, the red was very obvious. It actually had been blood. We huddled against the cliff face for a long time, feeling this was enough adventure for 10 trips. So at the first wisps of daylight, we we headed back, retracing our steps with much more speed than we had arrived with. We didn't stop to rest until the sun was up and we were miles from the cave. It was past sunset when we arrived back at the parking area, and ours was the only vehicle left. We used the restrooms, and then as we settled into our seats, we heard the most reassuring of all sounds. Our engine started. That has always been a fearful thought, being stranded in the middle of nowhere and the car won't start, especially after the kind of experience we just had. We slowly pulled out of the parking lot and took the road back toward the highway. It was still quite dark in the valley, and the deep shadows of this rough dirt road made it necessary to go slow to avoid the multiple potholes left from the spring thaw. The road curved and ran back to the easterly side of where we had hiked, and as I was about to mention something about the mountain peak where we had just been, Kim screamed, "Look out!" I grasped the wheel harder as I hit the brakes while following her gaze, and then I saw it too. A tall, spidery figure with long, stringy hair running alongside the car, and when I sped up to get away, it ran faster. It was the same frightening thing we had encountered on our hike. When I glanced at my speedometer, we were moving 60 miles an hour. It was all I could do to hold the wheel and try to avoid these larger potholes, yet the creature stayed right alongside Kim's window. Suddenly, headlights from an approaching vehicle appeared ahead of us, and I was forced to ease off the accelerator with a sigh of relief. And when we were about 100 yards from meeting, I slowed even more and asked Kim what our lanky friend was doing. She said, as I assumed, with the headlights approaching, it was gone. Then, as we were meeting the other vehicle, she shouted, "Look!" And as I turned to see what she was looking at, there, running at an angle away from the road, was a coyote. But it had been running on 2 legs, its hind leg. It also seemed to have that same wispy black pelt as the spidery creature that had been terrorizing us. Could they have possibly exchanged appearances? Don't know. I don't care. I was just real glad to get out of these frightening canyons in one piece. We vowed never to return to this haunted canyon again. This is a story told to me by a man only known as Crow. A man from the reservation just delivered a bull to a buyer's ranch, out to the far reaches of the reservation, getting lost for a couple hours in the process. It's a large expanse of land, and what maps are available aren't always reliable. Anyway, it's late and getting towards dark by the time he gets back on the main road towards home. Just as he gets to the intersection where there's a stop sign, he sees there up ahead, right in the middle of the road, a lone coyote. It's just standing there. So before he starts driving, he leans on the horn. In response, he watches as the coyote rises up on its back leg, assumes the form of a man, only his legs and feet, arms and hands seemed more canine than human, and with a spastic gait starts walking towards the opposite shoulder. The man, not believing what he's seeing, closed his eyes and starts shaking his head. When he again looks, there's the coyote sitting off to the side of the road and looking back at him, as if it's waiting for him to drive by. The man, now certain it's the light playing tricks on him, and then the fact that it's been a long and draining drive, he does just that. He passes right by. But as he passes the coyote, he gives it a quick look, and sees that it is grinning back at him in a way that is all too human. Having heard stories of skinwalkers, the man blesses himself, and fixing his eyes on the road straight ahead, steps on the gas pedal. Now, my friend Crow is an extremely honest and good man. I've never known him to make up any stories. He claims to personally know this man, and that he completely believes this story. I personally hope it's not true. I am Navajo. We had an incident with an unwelcome visitor in our home, and here's what happened. My cousin was sleeping over, and he's the same age as me. We were both 13 at the time. We were in my room talking and hanging out, and it was around 11 p.m. It was a pleasant summer evening, so my window was wide open, and it was pretty dark outside. My dad was in the living room, supposedly watching TV, but as always, he dozed off on the couch. My mom had already gone to bed. My cousin and I are keeping it down, but not yet ready to call it a night. All of a sudden, we hear the screen door to the front of the house open and then slam shut. We think it's my dad, but shortly after, my mom, she tells us this the next day anyway, claims she hears footprints on the carpet. Whoever it is, she says, goes through her room and towards the bathroom. She also naturally assumes it's my dad. Then she comes to the realization that she is unable to move, as if she's paralyzed. Still in my room, my cousin and I again hear the screen door open and slam, only much louder this time. It wakes up my dad and he comes to my bedroom checking on us. Finding us both there, he wants to know which one of my friends just slipped out of the house. It takes a few minutes, but we convince him that we are by ourselves and that we had been. We also explain that we thought it was him going in and out. I can see by the look on his face that he's not really buying it, but he has to admit we don't seem to be lying. He leaves, and as he's closing the door to my room, he tells us to stay out of trouble and go to sleep. All we can do is shrug. The next morning, my mom tells us what she heard and how she could not move. She also tells us that the second time the door slams, she hears what sounds like horse hooves run by her bedroom window. She has us all pray. We went outside to look, and we found the horse hooves about 40 yards past the house. The hooves slowly faded into human tracks. We followed them for about a mile, but they just disappeared. This brief encounter takes place the summer my boyfriend and I became engaged. I was certain it was a dark omen for things to come. The sun had just slipped behind the hills to the west. It was a beautiful night with a cool breeze coming out of the north. Perfect setting for taking a walk with someone you love. My fiancé and I set out just past the property, making our way leisurely across this open field and down toward a creek. As soon as we neared the trees, I noticed a tall, upright shadow. It suddenly shrunk down and slipped to the back of this majestic cedar that stands about 100 feet from the creek. I immediately stopped in my tracks, holding my fiancé's hand even tighter. I pointed to the tree and told him what I saw. He bent and picked up a few stones from the ground, and with his left hand, he moved me to his back as if for protection. He then took a few steps forward, and with his right hand threw the rocks towards the tree. His second throw hit it square. Immediately, a huge brown owl took to flight, soaring out over the creek. I have never seen one this big in these parts. The wings had a span longer than my arm. It might have been dusk, but I know that what I saw duck behind that tree was no owl. I believe whatever it was transformed itself and then flew off. In fact, I'm convinced. There's no other possible answer. After that, our summer took on a turn for the worse. My fiancé and I saw owls more than we'd ever seen before. Every time we went out of the house, every time we looked out the window, and every time we saw one, something would go wrong. We did, however, get married, and so far so good. Stay safe. Thank you for reading my story. It was winter of 1988 when my mother and I were driving home from the grocery store and saw something we'd never forget. I grew up in a small town in New Hampshire, one of those places where everyone seems to know the business of everyone else. Nonetheless, it possessed a feeling of community that you don't get in most larger towns and cities. Unfortunately, these smaller communities can also sometimes have a way of making you feel ostracized if you commit any behavior or present beliefs that are viewed as subpar. I was 14, and I was currently on holiday break from my first year of high school. My mother was in the driver's seat, and I was in the passenger seat. I can remember that I was holding a cake on my lap as a means to keep it stabilized on the winding road so that the icing wouldn't get all messed up. Everything felt as normal as could be. That's the thing with these types of encounters. It would seem as though the lesser you expect it, the better your chances are of having one. But then again, who in their right mind would expect a startling event like this? It was as we turned the corner that the headlights of our vehicle suddenly illuminated this large gray-colored animal. Now, I know it sounds stupid, but I remember first thinking it was a polar bear, or at least some sort of albino black bear. I suppose that was the only thing my mind could spawn as it raced to come up with any practical explanation. Its back was turned to us, as it focused on roadkill that lay before it. But it wasn't long at all until it swiveled its head and stared directly at the oncoming car. I remember suddenly getting so scared, as there was something about the shape of its eyes that still haunts me to this day. I don't know if I would go as far as to say that they were human-like, but there was something about them that led me to believe that this thing possessed much higher intelligence than any common animal. Right after my mother slammed on the brakes, she muttered the word devil, and then shortly after that muttered the words devil dog. I only lived with my mother and sister at the time, but both my parents were rather religious. It seemed they were always attaching a religious connotation to everything. I personally was never that religious. I participated as a means to make them happy, but I can't say I would have been as involved in a Catholic church if it wasn't for the two of them. And my sister basically felt the same as me. But I can't lie, there was something that felt outright evil regarding how the animal glared at us. I think that if we had been on a straighter road, my mother would have shifted the gear into reverse and backed away from the animal as quickly as possible. But even though the road wasn't all that busy, there was still the chance that we would back straight into oncoming traffic. The animal just stared at us, seemingly waiting for us to make a move. I remember feeling whiplash from the car doing a 3-point turn before we began to drive in the opposite direction. As scared as I was, there was no doubt that my mother was even more frightened. Looking back on it, it's not all that surprising that the animal decided to chase the vehicle. Surely it could sense that we were frightened, and that must have prompted a predatory response. If it were me driving, I would have tried to go 100 miles an hour to get away from this thing. But the fact that these winding roads ran alongside cliffs made doing that far too dangerous. This allowed the animal to keep pace with us. I sat there in the passenger seat, hysterically screaming as it ran next to my door on all fours. Perhaps the strangest aspect of this occurrence was how it didn't even need to look at the road in front of it. It focused far more on my mother and I with its human but demonic-looking eyes. I remember how my mother was sobbing. There was no question that she thought this animal was a byproduct of the devil. As we swerved around the twists and turns of this treacherous road, I could hear her muttering various prayers. She was absolutely determined to get away from this animal, or as she called it, a demon. The visual of this animal running alongside the car is still difficult for my brain to comprehend, even to this day. There's something about its ears that stand out in my memory. They seemed abnormally large and pointy. The eyes were very deep inside the sockets, underneath a prominent brow line. The only reason I could see that the eyes had a human-like appearance was because the animal was frequently looking directly at me. It was while it was next to our car that I could appreciate the size of this thing. It was extremely muscular, and you could see the rippling definition in its limbs with every step it took. Suddenly a car was coming from the opposite direction. It seemed to appear out of nowhere, and almost made us run off the road and fall into the gorge below. The sound of its horn was so startling, making me feel as though I was snapping out of a trance. My mother slammed on the brakes, and we skated until we made contact with a large boulder that was right before the cliff. She had stepped on the brakes well before we got to that point, so there was nothing more than a little scratch to the bumper. Whoever was in the oncoming vehicle didn't even care to stop and see if we were okay. Even though we were very relieved to have not driven off the cliff, the reality of what had been following us quickly set back in. As my mother put the car in reverse, I anxiously looked all around, assuming that the animal was going to put its claw through one of the windows at any point. But there was nothing. All that could be heard were the sounds of the wind, along with other vehicles driving in the distance. I have no way of knowing where this devil dog disappeared to, but both my mother and I believe that it deliberately tried to run us off the road and kill us. I can't even say if the creature was physical or if it was spirit. All I know is that it was evil, canine, and it attempted to see us die. My mother told my father, and my father was actually the one who told a friend or coworker or someone, and that's how word got out about our experience. When people approached me about it, I didn't back down. I was very honest about my perception of the whole thing, mainly because I wanted others to keep out an eye for this animal. Have any of you seen this? I would love to know if anybody else has had a similar experience, or if it's just me. During my summers off from college, I had a job working on a ranch where my only regular duty was to drive around and monitor the grounds, making sure that wild animals kept their distance from the livestock. The property was spread out across many acres, and sometimes that made it very challenging work. Sometimes there would be one other guy around my age, named Jamie, who would be assigned a certain section. There was this one afternoon when Jamie and I were eating lunch together that he told me about a mysterious sighting he'd had earlier that morning. He claimed that he saw something standing on two legs, and at first glimpse thought it was a brown bear. However, he was aware that brown bears aren't native to this region. Additionally, he said its legs bent at the knees in a way that was very much like the hind legs of a dog, though he admitted that his vision of the lower body was impaired due to it standing behind the fence. If it weren't for the fact that he was all the way across the field, behind the opposite fence, he would have been much more intimidated. Jamie said it didn't create any noise of any kind during the initial sighting. By the time he reached for his binoculars and raised them to his eyes, the strange animal was no longer there. I wasn't one of those people who would immediately shut down the possibility of strange occurrences, but back then I had never even heard of a cryptid, let alone a dogman. Therefore, I leaned more towards the idea that there had to be some reasonable explanation. I'd sort of forgotten about the whole story until a few weeks later, when I saw something utterly peculiar running across a field. The speed of whatever this thing was, it was astonishing. Before that moment, I didn't know any living organism on the face of the earth was capable of moving at speed like that, especially on two legs. I'm not at all certain, but if I had to estimate, I'd say it was moving at around 40 to 45 miles an hour. Like I said, on two legs. I couldn't make out what it was carrying, but it looked to either be prey or perhaps even an offspring. That was as far as that sighting went. The following day, I met with Jamie at lunchtime. I told him about what I saw, and I have to say that it was nice to know that someone else had seen this thing. Otherwise, I think I would have had a much harder time coming to terms with it. Jamie and I both agreed that we should tell the owner as soon as possible, and we thought it would be best to do it together, so it would sound more credible. When we approached the owner, Marv, we were surprised to hear from him that he had also seen this thing before. However, it had been years since he had a sighting. That was when he revealed to us that this mysterious creature was the primary reason that he had started having workers patrol these grounds. He said that there were times when he would find dead livestock that nothing had taken the time to consume. He said that it was as if this thing enjoys the act of killing and will do so even when it's not hungry. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The way he talked about it was as if he'd been dealing with nothing more than a pack of aggressive wolves or something. It was like he had totally accepted that there are real monsters in existence, so what's the point of getting all worked up about it? Now that this thing was back, Marv equipped us with pistols that he wanted us to shoot into the air if we were ever to spot this creature again. I was never a big fan of guns, but I'll admit it made me feel a lot safer having this thing on me, while knowing that it was in the area. I was so freaked out by the idea of seeing this thing up close, and I was beginning to wonder whether I should ask for a raise. The speed at which I saw it move made it crystal clear that this thing was an ultimate predator. I did not doubt that it could sneak up on me at any time, and this made me paranoid enough to where I was constantly looking in every direction. I have to say, it was truly exhausting. If it did get enjoyment from the act of killing, what was to stop it from killing one of us? Or killing me? A couple of weeks passed without either of us spotting this mysterious creature. It wouldn't be until I heard Jamie fire off not one, but 2 gunshots that I knew the creature had returned. Feeling a responsibility to provide backup, I raced towards the area where I thought I heard the gunshots coming from. When I spotted Jamie, he was using his t-shirt to bandage his upper left arm. When I asked him what happened, he explained to me that he was crouched over the body of a murdered lamb, and that the creature came out of nowhere and took a swipe at him. He immediately fired a shot into the air, but when the creature barely budged, he fired a second shot, this time towards the creature. Although he missed, it was enough to scare the creature off. When I took a peek at the wounds, I was surprised to see that they were a lot thinner than I had expected. He said that it was still standing several feet away from him and wasn't close enough to dig too deeply into his flesh. However, it was still enough to warrant immediate bandaging. He brought me over to where the mutilated lamb was. Even though it was a bloody mess, it looked as though the creature had only taken a few bites from the corpse before it ran off. So, I suppose it didn't always kill just for fun. Maybe it heard Jamie coming, and maybe it stepped out of sight before Jamie even noticed it. Jamie confirmed the massive size of the creature, and I remember him saying how he for sure thought he was going to die. He believed that if he hadn't had that pistol, there's no way he would have been here to tell me about this incident. When we went to tell Marv about it, the man was pretty shaken by what had happened to Jamie. He seemed very discouraged by it, and he got on the phone and dialed the police right in front of us, although I noticed he didn't mention anything about Jamie's injury. We watched from a distance as one police car rolled up to Marv's home. Jamie and I sat there for a while observing, waiting to see if anyone needed us for anything. And it wasn't long before a couple more police cars rolled up behind the first one. But none of the police officers ever approached us with any questions. It was later that day that Marv informed Jamie and I that he was going to give us paid leave until further notice. Believe it or not, those paychecks kept coming until the end of summer, without either of us having to work a single day. I always wondered what went on there while we were absent. Could he have gotten the authorities involved in the mystery in the past? I never saw it again with my own eyes, but Jamie told me that he once saw a heavy-duty military-grade vehicle pull up into the long road that leads into the farm. I can't imagine what else something of that grade would have been needed for on Marv's farm. Additionally, could there have been more than one of those strange creatures residing near the property? Marv never mentioned seeing more than one of them at a time, but he was also very vague on the subject. I think it scared him. And when he spoke about it, it really seemed to me that he had an extremely difficult time accepting that these creatures were real, regardless of how long he'd known about them. I've never seen a Bigfoot or any other cryptid, but given that I know with 100% certainty that these dogmen exist, I don't doubt at all that there are all sorts of weird things running around out there. Stay safe and watch your back. I first ran into a dogman in Hancock County, Mississippi when I was the age of 9, and then once again when I was 17. It made me feel as though something was always watching me whenever I get the courage to step into the woods. You may or may not know what a vortex howler is, but I was at a field with my dad that was within walking distance from our house, tossing the thing around. My dad and I were doing this thing where we tested just how far we could throw the vortex. My small arm couldn't throw it anywhere near as far as he could, and it was so much fun for me to watch how high and how far he could make it fly. I'd basically assumed the role of a dog during this activity, running to fetch it wherever it landed, just so that he could launch it again. It was probably after 10 or so throws that it landed right near the edge of the surrounding forest. Once I made my way over to the woods, it was right before I was about to grab the vortex that I saw it. What was probably only a few yards into the woods was what I initially thought to be a very tall adult in a costume. The only reason I thought that was because it was standing on two legs, just like a human. But I think it was when I saw the shape of those legs that, even at such a young age, I was able to establish that it couldn't be a human. Although the tall animal was silent while it stared at me, I could see its diaphragm inhaling and exhaling, as well as its muscular arms hanging, but twitching. The shaking of its arms is always one of the first things that pops into my head whenever I think about the Dogman. I only got the smallest glimpse of the face since I was already terrified by the time I looked up and saw it. It was standing in the shade, and all I really remember about it was that it had pointy ears and a wet snout full of sharp teeth. It truly did look like something straight out of a nightmare, even though I was so young and had no experience with anything like it. My instincts told me to take slow steps backwards without making any major commotion, but it was when I felt that I was a good distance away from the forest edge that I turned and sprinted with everything I had towards my dad. When I got over to him, he had a smile on his face and was chuckling because he probably assumed that I was startled by something as small as a snake or maybe a spider. Understandably, he didn't take me too seriously when I told him what I saw. I'm a bit embarrassed to say that I stood behind my dad as I looked toward the forest, and there was nothing else in sight. It was gone. When my dad started walking towards the area to grab the vortex, I remember I was holding onto his arm, desperate to prevent him from going near this Dogman. He assumed I had either imagined what I saw or had confused some normal animal for some monster. I was a child after all, so how can I blame him? It's exactly how I would have acted if I had never seen anything like this either. Much too frightened to go any further, I decided to stay put while he made his way over to the vortex. As he glanced into the woods, his casual body language communicated that there was no longer anything unusual over there. Since he was making his way back towards me, I was so goddamn worried that the Dogman was going to burst from the forest and pounce on him from behind. Although it seemed that the coast was now clear, I insisted that we head home, and luckily my dad obliged. I remember how, even on the car ride home, my body was still shaking. It felt as though my mind was so badly wanting to forget what it had just seen. Nothing further came of that sighting, and as the years went on, it steadily faded towards the back of my mind. For some reason, I'm willing to bet that that whistle from the Vortex Howler played a big role in attracting this Dogman to the park. Sure, it could have already been in the area, but the noise that toy makes is just so unique that I could see it raising the curiosity of any intelligent nearby wildlife. As I stated before, my second encounter with a Dogman happened when I was 17 years old and a senior in high school. We still lived in the same town and the same house. I had my high school sweetheart, Erin, over, and we were watching a movie in the dark. I remember it was thunderstorming because I kept anticipating that the power was going to go out. My parents were on vacation for their anniversary, and looking back on it, they sure did put a lot of trust into their only child to not throw a huge party. There was one point when Erin got up to use the bathroom, and I heard her scream. I assumed that she had spotted a mouse. We were constantly dealing with mice infestations while I was growing up, but that was far from the case. She didn't respond when I asked her whether she had just seen a rodent. Instead, when I got up from the sofa and walked into the hallway, she ran right into me. She didn't respond when I asked her if she had seen a rodent. Instead, when I got up from the sofa and walked into the hallway, she ran right into me. She was petrified. I thought I could hear her heart beating through her chest. When I grabbed onto her shoulders, I noticed she was shaking uncontrollably. She was in awe. She kept pointing down the hallway, but seemingly could not catch her breath that she needed to get the words out about what she had seen. Heck, I was starting to think that she'd seen a ghost. I had heard strange noises while growing up in the house, and considering that we weren't the first residents to live there, it always seems like a possibility that there could be spirits roaming the interior. She just kept pointing down the hallway when finally she said the word wolf a couple of times. Honestly, at that time, the notion seemed far stranger to me than that of ghosts. I can't say whether anyone had ever had trouble with wild wolves in that community, but I had certainly never heard anything about them. My only conclusion was that some large dog might have gotten loose and wandered up to the window while my girl was in the bathroom. Of course, since it was storming, the atmosphere could have made a sudden sighting of any animal that much more frightening. At this point, the animal that I saw when I was a child was not at all in the forefront of my mind. Erin explained to me that it was when she lifted the toilet seat that lightning lit up the area, and she briefly saw a wolf looking through the small circular window to the right side of her. It was when she made eye contact with the animal that she screamed. When I entered the bathroom, I approached the window, but saw nothing outside. It then occurred to me that it would have had to have been a massive dog, something about the size of a mastiff, perched up on two legs to be able to look through that window from the outside. It was not a low window. I was inclined to think that Erin might have imagined whatever she thought she saw, and that was when my childhood encounter dawned on me. I immediately started thinking about how dismissive my dad was when I told him about the Dogman. But still, I found the chances of Erin seeing the Dogman around my property before I ever saw or heard any sign of it to be incredibly slim. I continued to brush it off, and being the eager teenage boy that I was, I just wanted to move on from the subject and return her to the sofa. It was about an hour later that our makeout session was interrupted by the sound of something scratching at one of the nearby windows. Erin was immediately frightened again, repeating how the wolf was back. It was too dark to see anything outside, and when I heard the noises again, this time coming from a different window, I jumped up and flipped on the outside lights. That was when I saw it. The sight caused me to freeze up, a real trip down memory lane. About 10 feet away from the living room patio was what I believe to be the exact animal I saw when I was 9 years old. To me, it looked very much like one of the lichens in those underworld movies. Only the snout wasn't quite as elongated. Its snout was a lot like what you would see on a baboon, but everything else about it looked like a combination of a man and a wolf. "Do you see it?" Erin murmured from the sofa. "Do you see it?" The animal wasn't looking at me when I first went over to the window, but it soon turned its head and we locked eyes. The way it looked at me haunts me. If it was the same animal, it was like it was intelligent enough to remember me, even after all those years. "It's out there, isn't it?" Erin said. I told you. Well, what should we do?" The way she said that made it clear that she knew we weren't dealing with anything remotely close to an ordinary animal. The tone of her voice emphasized that we were dealing with a true monster. At first I was inclined to call the police, or at the very least animal control. However, there was this nagging part of me that warned I could very easily be setting someone up for their unexpected demise. Some poor animal control employee to be mangled by this creature. Just by looking at it, you knew it could inflict fatal damage with minimal effort. There was no question that it could dominate even the largest of land predators, such as even a grizzly bear or a polar bear. Also, I think I didn't want to risk my parents getting notified that police or any other authorities had been there. I just wanted to keep everything as cool as possible so they wouldn't second-guess leaving me with the house again. I had Erin hold my hand and walk with me to the garage, where I quickly and quietly grabbed an aluminum baseball bat, as if it was going to do any good. After I brought her back over to the sofa, I stepped back over to the window where I last spotted the Dogman, and it was nowhere in sight. Erin and I laid there on the couch for the remainder of the night, too spooked to do much of anything. I remember how the next morning she had a bit of a rough time coming up with an excuse to give her parents as to why she never made it home. She was too frightened to leave. I never saw the Dogman again after that night. I didn't tell too many people these experiences, and that alone makes me wonder how many strange things happen to people on this earth every day. All of the reports must make up the tiniest fraction of what truly goes on out there. I really hope you enjoyed my account. It frightens me to this day, and I'll never actually know what happened to that Dogman. Part of me wishes I could see it again for more confirmation, and the other part of me is so happy that I never had to.